Chapter 1. The Married Couple Who Aren't. Marcy adjusted the straps of her sundress as she stepped onto the Baxter family's back porch, the smell of grilled burgers and sweet corn drifting through the warm summer air. Laughter bubbled from the yard where Scott was, of course, holding court near the grill, spatula in hand like it was a microphone. Marcy. Scott waved so enthusiastically that the spatula flung a rogue burger onto the grass. He stared at it for a beat, then shrugged. 5-second rule. Not for meat, Scott, Marcy said, laughing as she crossed the yard. Please tell me you didn't serve that to anyone. Of course not, he said, tossing it onto a plate labeled for the dog. See? Responsible adulting. You're 34, she teased, sliding into the lawn chair beside him. Adulting shouldn't still be a verb for you. Scott grinned, oblivious to the way her heart did that annoying flip it always did when he smiled like that. Wide, genuine, like the world was a joke only he understood. If adulting wasn't a verb, I'd have to admit I'm bad at it. Before Marcy could reply, Scott's mom, Linda, appeared with a tray of lemonade. Look at you two, she said, setting the glasses down with a dramatic sigh. Always together. You're practically an old married couple. Scott froze mid-sip. Mom, oh, don't mom me, Linda said, wagging a finger. You bicker over groceries, you finish each other's sentences, only because Scott never finishes his own, Marcy cut in, smirking. See? Linda threw her hands up. Married. Scott's ears turned pink. We're not. Marcy and I are just best friends, Marcy supplied smoothly, looping an arm around his shoulders and giving him a quick squeeze. Since kindergarten. Scott stiffened like she'd just announced his tax returns to the crowd. Right? Best friends. The hug lasted 2 seconds, but Scott looked like he needed a recovery period. He busied himself flipping burgers, muttering something about perfect grill marks, while Marcy hid a smile behind her lemonade. Across the yard, Samantha, Scott's younger sister, caught Marcy's eye and winked. Marcy rolled her eyes. Samantha had been making that matchmaker face for months now, and Marcy wasn't sure whether to thank her or throttle her. Hey, Mars, Scott said suddenly, breaking her thoughts. You're not, seeing anyone right now, are you? The question was casual, tossed out like a frisbee, but Marcy felt her pulse spike. She kept her tone light. Why do you ask? Scott shrugged, flipping another burger. Just, you always have guys texting you. Figured you were busy. Marcy laughed. Because what else could she do? Oh, those. Just friends. Scott nodded, clearly filing that under things I don't understand but won't ask about. Cool. I mean good. Friends are good. Linda returned, this time with a camera. Smile, lovebirds. Scott nearly dropped the spatula. Mom. Marcy leaned in, grinning wide for the photo. Say cheese, husband. Scott groaned. You're enjoying this way too much. Absolutely, Marcy whispered as the camera clicked. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of teasing comments and Scott's increasingly awkward attempts to deflect them. When Marcy offered to help with the dishes later, he practically sprinted to the sink, babbling about efficiency and teamwork like they were Olympic sports. Scott, Marcy said softly as she handed him a plate. You know they're just joking, right? Yeah, he said, scrubbing like his life depended on it. I mean, we're not married. No, Marcy agreed, watching the way his jaw tightened. Not yet. His head snapped up, eyes wide. What? Marcy smiled sweetly. Relax, Baxter. It's a joke. Scott laughed, too loudly, too quickly, and went back to scrubbing. Marcy turned away so he wouldn't see the grin tugging at her lips. If only he knew how much truth was hiding in that joke. Chapter 2. Scott Baxter, socially oblivious hero. Scott Baxter had always considered himself a people person. He liked talking to strangers in grocery lines, complimenting random dogs on their fur, and asking baristas about their favorite coffee beans. He wasn't shy, far from it. He was just bad at reading the room. Case in point, last Tuesday at work, Scott had walked into the break room, spotted his coworker Jenna crying over a mug of tea, and decided the best way to cheer her up was to tell a joke about penguins. Why don't penguins ever get into arguments? He'd said brightly. Jenna had blinked at him, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Because they just let things slide. Scott had delivered the punchline with a flourish. Jenna had stared at him like he'd suggested eating her cat. Turns out, Jenna had just been dumped by a guy who loved penguins. Scott sighed at the memory as he pulled into his driveway. Social cues were like Morse code to him. He knew they existed, but he couldn't translate them to save his life. He grabbed his phone from the passenger seat and scrolled through his messages. Nothing from Marcy today, except a meme about squirrels hoarding snacks. Classic Marcy. She was probably busy. She always had guys texting her. Scott tried not to think about that too hard. It wasn't jealousy exactly. More like confusion. She was his best friend. His other half. The person who knew his favorite pizza toppings and the fact that he cried during animated movies. He couldn't imagine life without her. But every time he thought about saying something, anything, his brain short-circuited. What if she laughed? What if she said, Scott, you're like a brother to me? He'd rather eat a penguin joke than hear that. His phone buzzed. A text from Samantha. Sam, dinner at Mom's tomorrow. Don't be late. And wear something that doesn't look like you lost a fight with a laundry basket. Scott frowned at his faded t-shirt. It's vintage, he muttered to no one. The next evening, Scott arrived at his parents' house wearing what he considered his fancy shirt, a button-down that had survived 3 weddings and 1 unfortunate salsa incident. Samantha was already there, perched on the kitchen counter like a smug cat. Wow, she said, eyeing him. You clean up adequately. Thanks, Scott said, dropping his keys in the bowl. Where's Marcy? In the living room, Samantha said, smirking. Looking way better than you. Scott ignored that and headed in. Marcy was curled up on the couch, laughing at something on her phone. She looked up when he entered, and for a second, just a second, Scott forgot how to breathe. Hey, Baxter, she said, grinning. Nice shirt. Did you wrestle it out of retirement? Scott blinked. It's festive. It's beige. Beige can be festive, he argued, sitting beside her. In certain lighting. Marcy laughed, and Scott felt that weird warmth in his chest, the one he always pretended was indigestion. Before he could say something clever, or at least less stupid, Samantha popped her head in. So, Scott, she said sweetly, any big plans this weekend? Scott shrugged. Not really. Might reorganize my sock drawer. Marcy snorted. Living the dream. Hey, it's important, Scott said, dead serious. You can't just mix athletic socks with dress socks. That's chaos. Samantha rolled her eyes. You're hopeless. Scott frowned. Hopelessly organized. Hopelessly single, Samantha shot back. Scott choked on air. What? Why would you? Marcy elbowed him gently. Ignore her. She's just jealous of your sock system. Scott nodded, grateful for the save. Still, the word single echoed in his head like a taunt. He glanced at Marcy, who was scrolling through her phone again, and wondered, not for the first time, if she ever thought about him that way. Probably not. She had options. Guys who weren't him. Guys who didn't tell penguin jokes at funerals. Later, as he drove home, Scott made a decision. A big one. He was going to do something. Something memorable. Something that would show Marcy how much she meant to him, without risking the friendship. He gripped the steering wheel, determination settling in. He'd take her on a walk down memory lane. Literally. Recreate their favorite childhood moments. Fishing at the lake. Building forts. Eating way too many marshmallows. It was perfect. It was foolproof. It was probably going to be a disaster. But Scott Baxter had never let logic stop him before. Chapter 3. Samantha plots. Samantha Baxter prided herself on two things: her ability to organize chaos and her uncanny talent for spotting romantic stupidity from a mile away. And her brother Scott? He was the reigning champion of romantic stupidity. She stirred her coffee slowly, watching Scott through the kitchen window as he loaded his car with camping gear like he was preparing for a survival reality show. He hummed to himself, oblivious, probably thinking about marshmallows and fishing poles instead of the glaringly obvious fact that he was in love with Marcy. Hopeless, Samantha muttered. Her husband, Greg, looked up from his laptop at the kitchen table. What's hopeless? Scott, she said, gesturing toward the window like it explained everything. He's 34, Greg. 34. And he still hasn't figured out that Marcy is basically his soulmate. Greg smirked. Maybe he likes being single. Samantha snorted. Scott likes alphabetizing his spice rack. He doesn't like being single. He's just clueless. Greg closed his laptop, leaning back. So what's your plan, mastermind? Samantha grinned. Funny you should ask. Later that afternoon, Samantha sat cross-legged on Marcy's mom's couch, a notebook in her lap and a gleam in her eye. Across from her, Linda, Scott's mom, was perched in an armchair, sipping tea like this was a perfectly normal family meeting. Marcy's mom, Diane, looked skeptical. You want to what? Operation Baxter Bliss, Samantha announced, underlining the title in her notebook with dramatic flair. We're going to nudge Scott and Marcy into realizing what everyone else already knows. Linda clapped her hands. Finally, I've been waiting years for this. Diane raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do you plan to nudge them? Samantha flipped the notebook around so they could see her bullet points. 1. Camping trip, both families together. Neutral ground. Nostalgia factor. 2. Couples activities, dance lessons, horseback riding, canoeing. All conveniently paired. 3. Strategic teasing. Light, playful, nothing too obvious. 4. Emergency intervention. If Scott still doesn't get it, we escalate. Linda leaned forward. Escalate how? Samantha grinned. Don't worry. I'll improvise. Diane chuckled. You sound terrifying. Thank you, Samantha said sweetly. Now, here's the beauty of it. Scott already thinks this trip is his idea. He wants to recreate childhood memories. She made air quotes. Which means he's going to do half the work for us. Linda laughed. That boy. He probably thinks building a blanket fort will seal the deal. Honestly, Samantha said, tapping her pen against her chin. It might. By the time Samantha left Diane's house, the plan was in motion. Texts were flying. Cabins were booked. Activity schedules were mysteriously rearranged so Scott and Marcy would end up in every possible scenario that screamed romantic opportunity. As she drove home, Samantha felt a thrill of satisfaction. She'd been patient long enough. If Scott didn't figure out his heart soon, she was fully prepared to tie him to a canoe and float him toward enlightenment. Chapter 4. The camping trip begins. Scott Baxter was convinced this was going to be the best idea he'd ever had. He parked his car at the edge of the campground and stepped out, inhaling deeply like he was about to conquer Everest. The air smelled like pine trees, lake water, and adventure, or maybe just bug spray. Either way, it was perfect. He popped the trunk and surveyed his supplies: fishing rods, marshmallows, a cooler full of sodas, and his piece de resistance, a duffel bag stuffed with blankets for the ultimate fort-building experience. Scott grinned. Nostalgia was about to hit Marcy like a freight train of feelings. Scott, Samantha's voice rang out across the gravel lot. She was waving like she was directing traffic, her sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Behind her, both families were unloading cars in a flurry of coolers, folding chairs, and suspiciously large bags of snacks. Scott jogged over, nearly tripping on his own enthusiasm. Sam, isn't this great? Look at this place. Cabins, a lake, horses, actual horses. Samantha smirked. Yeah, it's like summer camp for grown-ups. Except with fewer hormones and more back pain. Scott laughed. Speak for yourself. I'm in peak condition. Sure, Samantha said dryly. Peak condition for alphabetizing spices. Before Scott could retort, Marcy appeared from behind her mom's SUV, tugging a suitcase that looked like it could fit a small country. She wore a simple tank top and jeans, her hair pulled into a messy bun that somehow made Scott forget how words worked. Hey, Baxter, she called, smiling like the sun had decided to show off. Ready to rough it? Scott grinned, trying to play it cool. Absolutely. I brought marshmallows. And bug spray. And, extra socks. Marcy laughed. Wow, you really know how to party. He opened his mouth to say something clever, maybe about sock organization, but Samantha swooped in like a hawk. Scott, you're in cabin 2 with Marcy. Scott blinked. Wait, what? Relax, Samantha said, patting his shoulder. It's got 2 bedrooms. You'll survive. Scott nodded slowly, trying not to look like his brain had short-circuited. Sharing a cabin with Marcy. 2 bedrooms, sure, but still. His heart was doing jumping jacks. The group made their way down the trail toward the cabins, passing a sign that listed the campground's activities. Horseback riding, 10 a.m., dance lessons, 2 p.m., canoeing. All day, craft shack. Open. Scott's eyes lit up. Dance lessons? That sounds fun. Samantha snorted. You? Dancing? You trip over flat surfaces. I have rhythm, Scott protested. Somewhere. Marcy grinned. I'd pay good money to see that. Scott felt his ears heat up. You might get your chance. Behind them, Linda and Diane were whispering like conspirators. Scott caught snippets. Perfect opportunity and slow dance. He frowned. What are you two plotting? Nothing, Linda said too quickly. Just sunscreen. Scott narrowed his eyes. Sunscreen doesn't require giggling. When they reached cabin 2, Scott held the door open for Marcy like a gentleman, or at least like someone trying very hard to look like one. The cabin was cozy. Wooden walls, 2 small bedrooms, and a living area with a couch that had seen better decades. Marcy dropped her bag with a sigh. This is cute. Yeah, Scott said, glancing around. Perfect for, relaxing. And building forts. Marcy raised an eyebrow. Forts? Scott grinned sheepishly. You'll see. As the family settled in, the banter continued. Samantha popped her head in. Scott, don't forget the dance lesson at 2. Scott frowned. Why does everyone keep mentioning that? Because, Samantha said sweetly, it's going to be hilarious. Linda appeared behind her. And romantic. Scott blinked. Romantic. Marcy smirked. Don't worry, Baxter. I'll lead. Scott groaned. That's probably for the best. Later, as Scott unpacked his duffel bag of blankets, he felt a surge of excitement. This was it. The start of his grand plan. He'd recreate their favorite memories, one by one, until Marcy realized what he'd known all along. Life was better with her in it. He just hoped he didn't accidentally set something on fire in the process. Chapter 5. Marcy figures it out. Marcy had always suspected Samantha was up to something. The woman had a look, a gleam in her eye that screamed schemer. But until now, Marcy hadn't had proof. She got it on the second morning of the trip. The day started innocently enough. Pancakes in the mess hall, Scott enthusiastically explaining why syrup distribution was a science, not an art, and Samantha pretending to listen while texting furiously under the table. Marcy caught the tail end of a message on Samantha's screen. Dance lesson confirmed. They're signed up as partners. Marcy blinked. Partners? She hadn't signed up for anything. Neither had Scott. He'd been too busy debating the ethics of eating marshmallows before noon. Suspicious, Marcy excused herself and wandered toward the craft shack, where she found her mom and Linda huddled together like teenagers plotting a prank. They stopped talking the second she walked in. Morning, Marcy said slowly. What are you two whispering about? Nothing. Linda chirped, far too brightly. Just macrame. Macrame. Marcy raised an eyebrow. You don't even know what macrame is. Linda flushed. It's the type of pasta? Marcy crossed her arms. Try again. Diane sighed. Fine. We were discussing activities. Activities, Marcy repeated. Like horseback riding? Canoeing? Dance lessons. Both moms froze. Guilty as charged. Oh my God, Marcy said, realization dawning. You're matchmaking. Linda clapped her hands. Finally, she gets it. Diane groaned. Linda, subtlety was the plan. Marcy stared at them, half amused, half stunned. You roped Samantha into this, didn't you? She volunteered, Linda said cheerfully. She's very passionate. Marcy laughed, shaking her head. You're all ridiculous. Ridiculously supportive, Diane corrected. Sweetheart, you and Scott belong together. Everyone sees it. Marcy opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Because the truth was, they weren't wrong. She'd loved Scott for years, quietly, patiently, hoping he'd figure it out. And if her family wanted to give him a little push, well, maybe that wasn't the worst idea. Marcy felt a slow grin spread across her face. Fine, she said. You want me to play along? I'll play along. Linda squealed. Yes. Team effort. Diane looked relieved. Just don't scare him off. Oh, don't worry, Marcy said, her grin turning mischievous. I'll make sure he catches up. Linda leaned forward, eyes sparkling. We've got a whole schedule planned. Dance lessons today, horseback riding tomorrow, and oh, canoeing. Very romantic. Marcy laughed. Romantic? With Scott. He'll probably tip the canoe. Then you'll have to cling to him for dear life, Linda said, winking. Diane groaned. Linda, stop writing fanfiction. Linda ignored her. And the dance lesson? Perfect opportunity for a slow song. Marcy snorted. Scott Baxter can't dance. He trips over flat surfaces. Even better, Linda said. You'll have to hold him up. Marcy shook her head, laughing. You two are dangerous. Dangerously brilliant, Linda corrected. Later, as Marcy walked back toward the cabins, she spotted Scott by the lake, wrestling with a fishing rod like it was a wild animal. He looked up and waved, his smile so bright it made her chest ache. She waved back, her mind buzzing with possibilities. If Scott thought he was in control of this trip, he was about to learn otherwise. Game on. Chapter 6. Memory Lane, Baxter style. Scott Baxter was a man on a mission. A nostalgic, slightly ridiculous mission, but a mission nonetheless. He stood in the cabin living room, hands on his hips, surveying the battlefield. 2 chairs, a sagging couch, and a coffee table that looked like it had survived a bear attack. Perfect. He dumped his duffel bag on the floor and began pulling out blankets like a magician revealing scarves. Operation Blanket Fort, he muttered. Phase 1. Impress Marcy. He draped one blanket over the chairs, another across the couch, and then realized he had no idea how to keep the whole thing from collapsing. Childhood forts had been easier. Gravity hadn't cared back then. He grabbed a roll of duct tape from his bag, because Scott Baxter planned for emergencies, and started taping corners like a man possessed. By the time Marcy walked in, Scott was half under the fort, muttering about structural integrity. What are you doing? Her voice was amused, curious, and just a little suspicious. Scott popped his head out, hair sticking up like he'd been electrocuted. Surprise. It's a fort. Like when we were kids. Marcy blinked at the blanket monstrosity. Scott, this looks like a crime scene. It's a work in progress, he said defensively. You remember how we used to build forts and eat snacks and tell ghost stories? Best times ever. Marcy's lips curved into a smile. You're recreating our childhood memories? Scott grinned, proud. Exactly. Memory lane, Baxter style. Marcy laughed, shaking her head. You're ridiculous. Ridiculously thoughtful, Scott corrected, crawling out and dusting himself off. Come on, help me. You were always the fort architect. She rolled her eyes but knelt down, tugging blankets into place with practiced ease. You know, most people just talk about memories. They don't reenact them. Talking is boring, Scott said. This is immersive nostalgia. Marcy chuckled. You should trademark that. When the fort was finally standing, lopsided but sturdy, Scott crawled inside and patted the spot next to him. Welcome to the Baxter Marcy Memory Dome. Marcy crawled in, laughing. This is so dumb. Dumb but awesome, Scott said, handing her a flashlight like it was a sacred relic. Now snacks. He produced a bag of marshmallows and 2 cans of soda from his cooler. Marcy stared at him. You really planned this? Scott shrugged, suddenly shy. You're my best friend. I wanted this trip to be special. Marcy's heart did a somersault, but she masked it with a grin. Well, mission accomplished. Scott beamed, oblivious to the way her chest tightened. Next stop, fishing at the lake. Just like when we were 10. Marcy groaned. Scott, last time you went fishing, you hooked your own shirt. That was a fluke, he said solemnly. This time, I'm prepared. An hour later, they were at the lake, Scott wrestling with a fishing rod like it was a wild animal. Marcy sat on the dock, laughing so hard she nearly fell in. Scott, you're supposed to cast the line, not yourself. I'm working on it. Scott grunted, the rod bending at an alarming angle. This fish is aggressive. There's no fish on the line, Marcy said, wiping tears from her eyes. You hooked the dock. Scott froze. Oh, Marcy collapsed into laughter again, and Scott, despite the humiliation, couldn't help laughing too. Because this was exactly what he wanted. Her smile, her laugh, the way the world felt lighter when she was near. He tried again, determined to redeem himself. The line sailed out and snagged on a tree branch. Marcy wheezed. You're single-handedly destroying the ecosystem. Scott glared at the tree. It started it. When he finally freed the line, he managed a decent cast, only for the reel to jam. Scott yanked. The rod snapped forward, and a spray of lake water drenched his shirt. Marcy clapped her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Oh my God, Baxter, you're a menace. Scott grinned sheepishly, water dripping from his hair. Still better than last time. Marcy shook her head, smiling so wide it hurt. You're impossible. Impossible but entertaining, Scott said, puffing out his chest. And hey, at least you're laughing. Marcy's laughter softened into something warmer. Yeah, she said quietly. I am. Scott didn't notice the shift in her tone. He was too busy plotting his next nostalgic masterpiece. Chapter 7. The Dance Disaster, Scott's POV. Scott Baxter had never feared 2 words more than he feared these. Dance lesson. He stood in the open-air pavilion, staring at the instructor, a tall man with perfect posture and a smile that said, I will make you suffer gracefully. Couples were already pairing off, swaying to soft music like they'd been born doing this. Scott glanced at Marcy, who was grinning like she'd just won the lottery. You're enjoying this way too much. Oh, absolutely, she said, looping her arm through his. Come on, Baxter. It's just dancing. Just dancing, Scott hissed. Marcy, I trip over flat surfaces. You'll be fine, she said, dragging him forward. Worst case, you break my toes. Scott paled. That's not comforting. The instructor clapped his hands. Partners, face each other. Gentlemen, lead. Ladies, follow. Scott swallowed hard and turned to Marcy. She was smiling, eyes sparkling with mischief. Ready? No, Scott said honestly. But let's do this before I pass out. He placed his hand on her waist, which felt like holding a live wire. His other hand clasped hers, sweaty and awkward. Marcy bit back a laugh. Relax, she whispered. It's not a bomb. Feels like one, Scott muttered. The music started. Scott stepped forward, straight onto Marcy's foot. Ow. Marcy yelped, then laughed. Scott, sorry. Scott panicked, trying to recover. He stepped back, onto her other foot. Baxter. Marcy doubled over, laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. You're a menace. I'm trying. Scott groaned, attempting a spin that nearly flung Marcy into a potted plant. The instructor winced. Gentle, sir. Gentle. Scott nodded frantically. Gentle. Got it. He tried again, slower this time, but his rhythm was interpretive at best. Marcy clung to him, laughing so hard tears streamed down her cheeks. Oh my God. You're like a malfunctioning Roomba, she wheezed. Scott gritted his teeth. Roombas don't have feelings, Marcy. Neither do my toes anymore, she shot back. Marcy's POV, Marcy couldn't stop laughing. She knew she should feel bad. Scott was clearly mortified, but watching him flail like a confused octopus was the highlight of her week. Okay, she said between giggles. New plan. I lead. Scott blinked. Is that allowed? Consider it a mercy rule, Marcy said, taking control. She guided him through the steps slowly, her hands firm on his shoulders. See? Easy. Scott stared at her, cheeks flushed. You make it look easy. That's because I'm amazing, Marcy teased, spinning him gently. And you're enthusiastic. Scott cracked a grin. Enthusiasm counts for something. It does, Marcy said softly, her laughter fading into something warmer. For a moment, their eyes locked, and the world narrowed to just the two of them swaying awkwardly under the string lights. Then Scott tripped over his own foot and nearly took them both down. Marcy burst out laughing again. Okay, Roomba. Break time. They collapsed onto a bench, Scott panting like he'd run a marathon. That was humiliating. That was hilarious, Marcy corrected, handing him a water bottle. And kind of adorable. Scott blinked. Adorable. Marcy smirked. Don't let it go to your head. Scott grinned, feeling something strange and electric in his chest. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew one thing. If dancing with Marcy felt this good, he'd trip over her toes 1,000 times just to keep her laughing like that. Chapter 8. Campfire Confessions. Almost. Scott's POV. The night was perfect. Stars scattered across the sky like glitter, the lake shimmering in the moonlight, and the crackle of the campfire filling the silence with warmth. Scott sat on a log, marshmallows skewered on a stick, heart pounding like a drumline. This was it. His moment. Marcy sat across from him, her face glowing in the firelight, laughing at something Samantha had said. Scott barely heard the words. All he could think was, tell her. Just tell her. He'd rehearsed it in his head 100 times. Marcy, you're my best friend, but I want more. I want forever. Easy, right? Except his throat felt like sandpaper and his brain was screaming, abort mission. The families were scattered around the fire, chatting and roasting marshmallows. Scott waited for the perfect lull, the moment when it was just him and Marcy. Finally, Diane and Linda wandered off to fetch more drinks. Samantha was busy lecturing Greg about proper Esmore technique, and Marcy turned to him with that smile, the one that made his chest ache. Scott, she said softly, you've been quiet. Scott swallowed hard. Just thinking. About what? Her voice was gentle, curious. Scott took a deep breath. Now. Say it now. About us. Marcy blinked, her smile faltering. Us. Scott nodded, gripping the stick like it was a lifeline. Marcy, marshmallows. Samantha's voice exploded like a firework. She barreled toward them, arms full of bags. Emergency marshmallow refill. Nobody panic. Scott flinched so hard his marshmallow flew off the stick and landed in the fire with a sad plop. Sam, he hissed. Seriously? What? Samantha dumped the bags dramatically. You can't have a campfire without marshmallows. It's a crime against humanity. Marcy was laughing now, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Scott, your marshmallow's toast. Scott stared at the charred blob in the flames, his confession shriveling with it. Yeah, he muttered. Guess I'll start over. Marcy's POV. Marcy bit back a smile as Scott fumbled for another marshmallow, his ears pink, his jaw tight. He'd been about to say something important. She could feel it. And then Samantha had swooped in like a chaos fairy. Marcy shot Samantha a look across the fire. Samantha winked. Not yet, her expression said. But soon. Marcy sighed, leaning back against the log. If Scott was working up the courage, she'd give him time. And maybe a little help. Scott's POV. Scott stared at the fire, frustration simmering in his chest. He'd been so close. So close. But maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow, he'd find the right moment. No interruptions. No marshmallow emergencies. He glanced at Marcy, who was smiling softly at the flames, and felt that surge of determination again. Tomorrow. He'd tell her tomorrow. Chapter 9. Saddle up for trouble. Marcy's POV. Marcy adjusted the helmet strap under her chin, eyeing the row of horses like they were part of a matchmaking conspiracy. Which, technically, they were. Samantha had made sure Scott and Marcy were signed up for the same riding session, and judging by the smug grin on her face across the paddock, this was no accident. Scott stood a few feet away, looking like a man about to negotiate peace with a large animal. His horse, a towering chestnut named Hercules, snorted loudly, and Scott flinched. Scott said, glancing at Marcy. Is it normal for them to breathe that aggressively? Marcy bit back a laugh. He's just saying hi. Sounds like he's saying, prepare to die. Marcy grinned, walking over to her own horse, a gentle bay named Daisy. Relax, Baxter. Horses can smell fear. Scott stiffened. Great. So I'm basically a walking buffet of terror. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Carla, clapped her hands. Okay, folks. Mount up. Scott stared at Hercules like he was trying to solve a math problem. Mount up, he muttered. Sure. Easy. Marcy swung onto Daisy with practiced ease, then turned to watch Scott attempt the same. He put one foot in the stirrup, grabbed the saddle horn, and froze. Scott, Marcy called, amused. You okay? Yep, Scott said through gritted teeth. Just bonding with Hercules. You're bonding with gravity, Marcy teased. Need a hand. Scott shot her a look. I've got this. He did not have this. After 3 awkward hops and 1 near faceplant, Scott finally landed in the saddle, backwards. Scott, Marcy doubled over laughing. You're facing the wrong way. Scott blinked at Hercules' tail. Oh, that explains the view. The instructor sighed. Sir, please turn around. Scott dismounted, cheeks flaming, and managed to get back on correctly this time. Nailed it, he said, trying for confidence. Marcy grinned. Sure, Baxter. You're a natural. The bold move. Once everyone was mounted, Carla led the group down a scenic trail. Marcy kept her horse close to Scott's, watching him grip the reins like they were live wires. You're tense, she said softly. Loosen up. Loosen up. Scott hissed. I'm sitting on 1,000 pounds of muscle with hooves. Marcy laughed. You're fine. Look, Daisy's calm. Hercules will follow her lead. Scott glanced at her, eyes wide. You trust me with your horse's emotional stability? I trust you with more than that, Marcy said, her voice dropping just enough to make his head snap toward her. Scott blinked. What does that mean? Marcy smiled, leaning closer in the saddle. You'll figure it out. Scott stared at her, completely thrown, and in that moment, Hercules decided to veer toward a bush. Scott yelped, jerking the reins, and nearly toppled off. Marcy reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm to steady him. Her fingers lingered, warm against his skin. Easy, she murmured. I've got you. Scott swallowed hard, his heart doing somersaults. Thanks, he said, voice rough. Marcy smiled, her grip firm for one more beat before she let go. Anytime. As they continued down the trail, Scott's brain was a mess of static. What did she mean? Why did that feel like electricity? And why do I suddenly want to impress her by not dying on this horse? Behind them, Samantha whispered to Linda. Did you see that? Hand grab. We're making progress. Linda grinned. If he falls off, she'll have to catch him. Perfect. By the time they returned to the stables, Scott was sweaty, exhausted, and more confused than ever. Marcy, on the other hand, looked like she'd just won a game only she knew the rules to. And maybe she had. Chapter 10. The Big Misunderstanding. Scott's POV. Scott Baxter was feeling good. Better than good, actually. The horseback ride had been terrifying, sure, but Marcy had laughed, really laughed, and she'd touched his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. For a brief, shining moment, Scott thought maybe, just maybe, he was getting somewhere. Then he heard it. He was walking past the craft shack, heading back to the cabin to plan his next memory lane masterpiece, when voices drifted through the open window. Familiar voices. Marcy's mom, Samantha, and Marcy. Scott froze. I think it's working, Diane said, her tone conspiratorial. He's finally noticing. Marcy laughed, a soft, amused sound that made Scott's stomach twist. You guys are relentless. Linda chimed in. Sweetheart, we just want you happy. Marcy's voice again, teasing. Happy or pressured? Scott's heart stopped. Pressured. The word hit him like a punch. He stepped back, pulse thundering in his ears. They were pushing her. For him. Oh God. He'd thought this trip was fun, natural, their families just hanging out. But if Marcy felt cornered, if she was only laughing because she didn't want to hurt his feelings, Scott's throat tightened. He couldn't do that to her. He couldn't be the guy who made her feel trapped. He turned and walked away, his chest heavy, his grand plan crumbling like a badly built fort. Marcy's POV. Inside the craft shack, Marcy rolled her eyes at her mom's dramatic sigh. I'm not pressured, she said firmly. I'm just waiting for him to catch up. Linda grinned. Then keep nudging. Marcy smiled faintly, but her thoughts were elsewhere. On Scott. On the way he'd looked at her during the ride. Like she was the only person in the world. For a second, she'd thought he was about to say something. Maybe tonight, she hoped. She had no idea he was already halfway back to the cabin, convinced she didn't want him at all. Scott's POV. Scott sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the duffel bag of blankets like it had betrayed him. He'd been so sure this was the right move. Recreate their memories, remind her how much she meant to him. But if she felt pressured? If this whole trip was some family scheme? He couldn't risk it. He'd rather stay her friend forever than lose her completely. So he did the only thing his scrambled brain could think of. He pulled back. No more forts. No more fishing disasters. No more almost confessions. Just Scott Baxter, best friend. The role he'd mastered. The role that wouldn't break her heart. Or his. Chapter 11. Intervention and Insanity. Samantha's POV. Samantha Baxter had reached her limit. She found Scott sulking on the porch of cabin 2, staring at the lake like it had personally betrayed him. His posture screamed melodrama, and Samantha was done watching him mope like a rejected soap opera star. Scott, she said, marching up and planting herself in front of him. What is your deal? Scott blinked. My deal. Yes, your deal, Samantha snapped. You've been walking around like someone canceled Christmas. Spill. Scott sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's complicated. Try me, Samantha said, crossing her arms. Scott hesitated, then muttered. I overheard Marcy talking about feeling pressured. Samantha stared. Pressured? Yeah, Scott said miserably. By this trip. By me. I don't want her to feel trapped, Sam. Samantha pinched the bridge of her nose. Oh my God. You absolute walnut. Scott frowned. Walnut? Yes. Samantha threw her hands up. You misheard. She's not pressured by you. She's pressured by us. Because we're all rooting for you two to stop being idiots. Scott blinked. Wait, what? She likes you, Scott, Samantha said, enunciating every word like she was teaching phonics. She's been in love with you since forever. Scott's brain short-circuited. She what? Samantha groaned. Do I need to draw you a diagram? Scott's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She likes me. Likes you. Samantha snorted. She's practically planning your wedding in her head. Scott sat there, stunned, while Samantha jabbed a finger at his chest. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop sulking, stop overthinking, and tell her how you feel. Scott swallowed hard. Tell her. Right. Easy. Not easy, Samantha said. But necessary. And make it big. Scott blinked. Big. Big, Samantha repeated. Grand gesture. Something so Scott Baxter it'll knock her socks off. Scott's eyes lit up slowly, like a dim bulb finding power. Grand gesture, he murmured. I can do that. Samantha narrowed her eyes. Define do that. Scott grinned. A grin that made Samantha deeply nervous. You'll see. Scott's POV. By the time Samantha left, Scott's brain was buzzing like a caffeinated bee. A grand gesture. Something unforgettable. Something that screamed Scott Baxter loves Marcy. He paced the cabin, muttering ideas. Flowers? Too boring. A speech? Too risky. A serenade? He couldn't sing without sounding like a dying goose. Then his gaze landed on the duffel bag of blankets. The fort. Not just any fort, a mega fort. The ultimate nostalgia bomb. He'd build it by the lake, string up lights, stock it with snacks, and invite Marcy inside like they were kids again. Except this time, he'd tell her everything. Scott grinned, adrenaline surging. Operation Blanket Fort, final boss edition. He grabbed the blankets, duct tape, and every flashlight he owned. This was going to be epic. This was going to be romantic. This was going to be, probably a safety hazard. But Scott Baxter didn't care. He was all in. Chapter 12. The Outlandish Confession, Scott's POV. Scott Baxter had never worked so hard in his life. Blankets draped over chairs, coolers, and anything vaguely fort-shaped. Flashlights strung up like fairy lights. Snacks arranged in neat piles. He even borrowed Samantha's battery-powered lanterns for ambience. By the time he finished, the lakeside fort looked like a Pinterest board gone rogue. Scott stood back, hands on his hips, grinning like a mad scientist. Perfect, he whispered. This is it. Now all he had to do was get Marcy here without sounding like a lunatic. He found her near the stables, chatting with Diane. His heart thumped like a drum as he approached. Marcy, he said, trying for casual and landing somewhere between breathless and suspicious. Can you come with me? I have something to show you. Marcy raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. It's not ominous, Scott said quickly. It's nostalgic. Marcy laughed. Lead the way, Baxter. When they reached the lake, Marcy stopped dead. Her jaw dropped. Scott, what is this? Scott spread his arms like a game show host. Welcome to the Baxter Marcy Memory Dome, Deluxe Edition. Marcy stared at the sprawling fort, blankets fluttering in the breeze, lanterns glowing softly. You built this. Scott nodded, suddenly nervous. Yeah, I wanted to recreate our favorite memories. You know, forts, snacks, late-night talks. Like when we were kids. Marcy stepped closer, her smile softening. Scott, this is amazing. Scott swallowed hard. Come inside. Inside the fort, Marcy crawled in first, laughing as she settled onto a pile of cushions. Scott followed, heart pounding so loud he was sure she could hear it. He handed her a soda, then sat across from her, knees brushing. For a moment, it felt like they were 10 again, except Scott's chest was tight with something bigger, heavier, impossible to ignore. Marcy, he began, voice shaky. I need to tell you something. She tilted her head, eyes curious. Okay. Scott took a deep breath. You're my best friend. You've always been my best friend. But that's not enough for me anymore. Marcy blinked, her breath catching. Scott, I love you, he blurted, the words tumbling out like a runaway train. Not like a friend. Not like a sister. I love you like you're my person. My forever person. And I know I'm awkward and I miss cues and I probably ruined your toes in that dance lesson, but I can't imagine my life without you. I don't want to. Silence. The kind that feels like an eternity. Scott's stomach dropped. If you don't feel the same, that's okay. I'll still be your friend. I'll still build forts and fish badly. And, Scott. Her voice was soft, steady. Stop. He froze. Marcy leaned forward, her eyes shining. I've been waiting for you to say that for years. Scott blinked. Years? Years, she repeated, smiling through tears. You're my person too. Scott stared, stunned. Wait, so you? Yes, Baxter. Marcy laughed, wiping her cheeks. I love you. Scott's brain short-circuited. You love me. Marcy grinned. Do I need to draw you a diagram? Scott laughed. Wild, relieved, giddy, and then he kissed her. It was clumsy and perfect, and everything he'd been terrified to hope for. When they finally pulled back, Marcy rested her forehead against his. You know, she whispered, you didn't need a fort for this. Scott grinned. Maybe not. But admit it, it's a pretty great fort. Marcy laughed, kissing him again. Best fort ever. Outside, Samantha high-fived Linda and Diane, who were spying from behind a tree. Operation Baxter Bliss, Samantha whispered. Complete. Epilogue. Married couple for real. 6 months later, Scott Baxter stood in the middle of his living room, staring at a mountain of wedding gifts and wondering how his life had turned into a rom-com. Marcy breezed in, holding a mug of coffee and wearing his favorite hoodie, the one she'd borrowed and never returned. You look overwhelmed, she teased. Scott gestured at the pile. We have 3 toasters, Marcy. 3. People really want us to have warm bread, she said, sipping her coffee. Scott grinned, pulling her close. Remember when everyone joked we were an old married couple? Marcy smirked. Turns out they were right. He kissed her forehead, still marveling at how easy this felt. How right. Best fort ever, he whispered. Marcy laughed. You're never living that down. Family chaos. The doorbell rang, and in stormed Samantha, carrying a giant box labeled Emergency Wedding Survival Kit. What's in that? Scott asked warily. Snacks, duct tape, and a backup playlist, Samantha said proudly. Because if you're DJ Flakes, I'm not letting you slow dance to elevator music. Linda and Diane followed with matching grins. We brought champagne, Linda announced, and a slideshow of your childhood photos. Scott groaned. Please tell me it doesn't include the penguin sweater. Oh, it does, Diane said sweetly. Front and center. Marcy laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. I'm framing that one. Scott sighed, wrapping an arm around her. I'm married into chaos. Marcy kissed his cheek. You married me. Scott smiled, heart full. Best decision I ever made. Outside, the fort still stood in the backyard, reinforced with actual poles this time, twinkling lights strung across the top. Because some things, Scott decided, were worth keeping forever.